Hi everyone. Today I wanted to do a few things in a short video for you. Um, the first thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about how philosophy reading is different than other reading. I want to give you a few tips on reading philosophy, and then I'm going to take you through a couple of the sample pages of the reading you'll have to do this week. But what I'd really like to do is start with a real quick story. So imagine you walked into a science classroom and someone hands you a giant fat textbook like this and just handed it to you and said, okay, chapter 5 is due tomorrow. What do you think would happen? Now, we both know exactly what would happen. Most of the words you wouldn't understand. If there were formulas or problems like that, you wouldn't know how to do them. If there was some weird concepts that you never learned in the past, you'd be completely blank on where to go from there. And when they gave you this book and told you chapter 5 was due tomorrow, they'd be just dropping you right in the deep end. It would be almost impossible to pull off. Now, it might not seem like it, but reading philosophy can be just like that. The concepts behind much of this are thousands and thousands of years old. The language is old, as you can see right here. This book was written in 1879. There's going to be philosophers mentioned. You won't know who they are. It's going to be old-fashioned language that's a little bit difficult and annoying to work through. All of this stuff leads into making reading philosophy a little bit more difficult than reading, say, just a normal, web page or fiction book or whatever. And so you got to start with that in your head. So it's going to be a little slower than normal reading. It's going to be a little more difficult. They're talking about concepts. It's not a story. The concepts are difficult to work through. They're sometimes vague, and oftentimes, at least for me, I find myself disagreeing while I'm trying to read through these. So keep all of that mess in mind while we move forward. Okay, so why would you want to do all this? Why does it even matter? Um, the first answer, of course, is because it goes to your grade. You all get that part. But that's not what I'm really aiming at here. What I'm trying to get you to see is that reading philosophy creates a certain approach in your mind. It teaches you to read in a very critical fashion. One of the things you'll notice, for example, is if some of you will probably go on to be lawyers. Many lawyers were philosophy majors. Now, it's not because most of them were interested in philosophy, it's because reading philosophy, like we're going to do in this class, really helps you when you get to the complicated, difficult, disputed arguments of law. Okay? And this will also play out in many other ways. 10 years from now, you're working at a job and your boss hands you a giant manual and says, can you work through this and write me up a memo for next week? You've done it before. So when you're learning to read philosophy, you're also learning to read other difficult things. Okay, so you need it for your grade, of course. I get that part, but it's also gonna teach your brain to think and approach reading in a certain way. Okay, so let me get to a few of the tips. So if you look up on the text right here, I have them highlighted. Okay, there's way more than three. I'm just giving you three basic ones. So the first one I kind of hinted at already. Many people, when they get down to it, have to read philosophy multiple times. One, 5 or 10 page essay can take a little while to do. Okay, the words are hard, the concepts are hard. Sometimes you might disagree. That can slow you down too. In general, it's a little bit slower than normal reading, so plan for that. Okay. Part two is super important. There are going to be all kinds of words in here that you do not necessarily know. Highly educated people who read this, who weren't philosophers, would have no idea what half of them were. Um, that's what it means when you take a class. You're learning something new. You're learning the background and the lingo, so to speak, of philosophy. And you'll also kind of get stuck into the history of philosophy, which is really long and really complicated. Okay. Now you'll also get to other words which are just old-fashioned. Look them up. There's literally no excuse anymore. You all have a phone. Pull it out. Google the word. If you run into something you don't know, like right now I'm looking up there, and we see this guy right here. Epicurus, well, who the heck is that? I mean, I know who it is, but you probably don't. And he's going to play a huge part in what comes. So you need to just Google that. When you come to a word and you don't know it, don't pass it by, okay? Look it up. It's no longer a problem. When I was a kid, I had to run to an encyclopedia or a library to find it out. Now all you gotta do is just Google it. So no excuses. If you reach a word, Google it. You should know what every word means, okay? And finally, this might be the hardest part, but it's also the thing that makes reading philosophy such a useful skill in all other fields. And that is that it teaches you a habit of mind where you're reading something, okay? You're reading along, and Mill writes a long passage, and you go, huh, was that right? Just because Mill said it's right doesn't mean it's right. We're going to cover a few other philosophers. They're going to completely disagree with him, okay? So you need to work through this in your own mind. Don't just read it and think, oh, what am I going to need for the assessment? If you do that, you're going to miss half of it, okay? So read it critically, okay? At every point go, huh, what does he really mean there? And more importantly, and this is really actually more important, do you agree with what he's saying? He's going to say all kinds of things in a minute about happiness. Well, do you agree with him or not? Okay? So that's what I'm asking you to do here. Okay, so we're going to jump in just a little bit. I'm going to take you through a couple of pages very briefly. I'm not going to do the reading for you. I'm just going to give you some hints and tips on how to do that. Okay. So at the end of the first page here, on page 149, you're going to see this quote right here. Now, as you can see what I wrote here, this is the main quote of utilitarianism, okay? If you think back to last week's summary of the 3 ethical systems we're going to cover, this quote is there, okay? And the reason it's there is because everything Mill has to say throughout the rest of this reading is centered on this one quote, okay? So when you're reading through this quote, you've got to really get it, okay? And many of the things he's going to say are going to be ways for him to make this more clear. Many of the other things he's going to say is how to deal with his critics. So there's a long history and story to utilitarianism and to philosophy. And as soon as Mill wrote this or came up with this idea, many people attacked him. So a lot of what we're going to look at in here is him responding to his critics. So if it seems a little weird, like he's talking about somebody that you're not really sure who he's talking about, that's often who he's talking about. He said happiness is the most important thing. A lot of people went, happiness? Who cares about happiness? Ethics is about duty and being right. And Mill's responding to those people. So a lot of the times when you're reading, you're going to encounter that too. Okay? So as you begin here, I'm not going to read through all this. This is just to get you going. Pay close attention. Now, the first paragraph is largely introductory. Okay. Now, the next interesting point is you really need to understand the words here. I mentioned this at number 2 above, and I mentioned Epicurus. Now, in this paragraph right here, he's going to talk about something I just mentioned there. He's responding to critics, and he's pointing back to history to try to make his argument. And when I say history, I mean thousands of years before this, a couple thousand years before this. There was a guy named Epicurus. Epicurus founded Epicureanism. It was an entire philosophy based on a version of happiness. All you got to do is Google it. It's not that hard. Who was Epicurus? Okay, I just did it. There it is. You need to do the same thing, okay? If you understand what went on with Epicurus and how people attacked him, you'll understand what Mill's getting at in these next few paragraphs. But don't pass them by. It's important to the argument, okay? Let me make a couple of more points. I don't want this video to go on too long. It's just to give you a general idea of how to read through this. Now, as I mentioned it last week in a really brief summary of utilitarianism, one of Mill's main points is that you need to be a competent judge. This will come up definitely will come up in the assessment of what I'm asking you to do here. The source of it is right in this paragraph. Okay. So read through all this, make sure you understand a couple of things. First of all, understand like what is he saying? Like what are the actual words mean? And second, why do you think he's saying it? Do you have to be a competent judge to really understand how to do ethics? And what does it even mean to be a competent judge? But don't forget point three. Make sure you ask yourself, well, is that right? Am I a competent judge? If you're not, most of us probably aren't. Um, who is a competent judge? Who could be trusted to be a competent judge? Would you listen to them if they told you were right or wrong about something? So this is what I mean by reading critically. Okay. And finally, he's going to, in this section here, just after that, this goes on for a couple of pages actually, but I'm not going to go through it all. In this section here, he's going to really try to build in his response to the critics of his version of utilitarianism and happiness. Now, one of the main points they're going to make is that if we just focus on happiness, we might as well just be like animals. Now, he wants to really, really handle that critique carefully and in a lot of detail, as you'll see. And it's your job to read through that and figure it all out, okay? Remember, reading philosophy is very different than reading other things. It's slow, it's plodding, it's complicated. If someone asked you to define happiness, could you do it? It would be really hard. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to not only define what he means by happiness, but what he means by ethics. He's trying to create an entire ethic based on happiness. That's not easy to do. So be charitable, take your time. You don't have to agree with him. In fact, I could care less if you agree with him, but really understand what he's doing and think about it yourself. Think about it in your own life. Okay? So remember, philosophy, reading, very different than other reading. So take your time. Don't pass words by or phrases by or old-fashioned language by that you're not sure what they mean. Look them up, Google them. It only takes a second. Okay? And if you keep those things in mind and you're always critical as you go through, you should be fine. Okay? And if remember, as always, questions, problems, comments, just text me or email me. I'm happy to reply.